In the silent, calculated world of espionage, the most lethal indicators are those that masquerade as normalcy. Danger rarely screams, it whispers through the medium of the mundane and the repetitive. When a human behavior attains the level of mechanical flawlessness, it sheds its personal nature. It ceases to be an individual quirk and transforms into a deliberate, operational signature. It was exactly 6:07 a.m. on May 18, 1981. The streets of Arlington, Virginia, were bathed in the pale, amber glow of a rising sun. The morning air was still, carrying only the faint scent of dew. At that precise moment, the small bell fastened above the door of the Arlington Grill chimed. The sound was sharp and familiar, signaling a presence that respected the clock above all else. The timing was impeccable, not a second fast, not a second slow. Inside, Emily Carter was already deep into her routine, lifting the second glass pot of the morning to fill the waiting carafes. Emily had manned the dawn shift long enough to stop measuring time in minutes. For her, the world was divided into phases, each belonging to a specific slot in the morning's choreography. Behind the grill, the cook reached out and dialed down the volume of the radio without a word. The dishwasher paused for a fraction of a second, glancing at the entrance before returning to the steam. The staff recognized the chime, even before they saw the visitor. The man entered the diner alone, as he had done every day prior, carrying an aura of absolute, unyielding solitude. He was clad in a tan overcoat, a garment that seemed slightly out of place in the late spring warmth. Instead of using the hooks by the door, he carried it neatly folded over his left forearm. His eyes did not wander across the room, nor did he search for a vacant spot. He walked with a measured stride toward the counter, moving with a purpose that required no hesitation. He bypassed the empty booths and took his seat on the third stool from the register. His back remained perfectly straight against the window, his posture defying the natural urge to slouch. Emily approached him, her hand reaching for a standard thick-walled mug by habit. But she stopped herself. She remembered that this man did not seek the comfort of a heavy ceramic vessel. "Black coffee," he requested, his voice low and devoid of any regional inflection. "No cream, no sugar. I need it extra hot, and please, serve it in a porcelain cup." His words were not rushed, yet they lacked any conversational softness. It was a list of requirements rather than a request, delivered with a cold, almost surgical precision. Emily hesitated for a heartbeat. The Arlington Grill did possess porcelain cups, though they were relics of an older era, rarely seen by the truckers and clerks who frequented the counter. Those delicate cups sat on the highest shelf, reserved for tea or those few patrons who insisted on a certain level of refinement. Most servers never even considered offering them. The man didn't ask if they had one, he simply expected it. Emily reached up, retrieved the white porcelain, and wiped away a thin layer of dust before bringing it to the coffee urn. She poured the liquid slowly, allowing the steam to swirl into the air. The man watched the dark surface of the coffee settle, his expression as frozen as a portrait in a gallery. When she placed the saucer down, the handle of the cup was angled slightly to the right. Without looking away, the man reached out and nudged it until it pointed exactly forward. Emily watched this small adjustment with a growing sense of curiosity. In her line of work, she was a professional observer, a silent witness to the countless tiny rituals of humanity. She knew how truck drivers obsessively counted their nickels. She noticed how the Pentagon clerks checked their watches every 3 minutes, synchronized with some invisible grid. She saw the regulars who folded their napkins into identical triangles every morning. But the man on the third stool was different. His actions didn't feel like a habit, they felt like a script. When it came time to pay, he didn't reach into a messy pocket. He produced the exact change, the bills perfectly flattened and the coins arranged in a neat, descending line on the laminate. He took exactly 2 sips of the scalding liquid, then placed the cup back in the center of the saucer. He waited. At 6:12, he took the cup again, repeating the ritual with haunting accuracy. By 6:18, he unfolded a newspaper. It was a day old, yet he handled it as if it were a fragile document, ensuring that no creases or marks were left on the paper as he read. He ignored the headlines of the day, skipping the international section entirely. He turned the pages without making a sound, his fingers never smudging the cheap ink of the print. Emily wiped the counter nearby, watching his movements in the reflection of the stainless steel coffee urn. Every gesture was contained, efficient, and entirely devoid of emotion. At 6:29, the porcelain cup was empty. The man rose from his stool, leaving the vessel exactly where Emily had first placed it, his overcoat still perfectly draped over his arm. He offered a single, stiff nod, not a sign of gratitude, but a confirmation that the transaction was complete. Then, the bell chimed once more as he disappeared into the morning haze. The clock on the wall read 6:31. Emily picked up the cup, noting that the porcelain was still warm to the touch. She rinsed it by hand, dried it, and returned it to the top shelf. To any other observer, it would have been a mundane morning. There were no raised voices, no broken plates, and no sirens wailing on the street outside the diner's windows. A delivery truck hit the curb outside at 11:42, and a woman grumbled about her overcooked eggs at 1:05. These were the true rhythms of the Arlington Grill. But as Emily's shift ended at 2:17 p.m., the image of the man and his porcelain cup remained etched in her mind. It wasn't the strangeness of the order that bothered her. It was the feeling of recognition. It was a ghost of a memory, tugging at the corners of her consciousness, originating from a time long before she had moved to Virginia. Years ago, while she was a student at a community college in Maryland, she had worked at a small diner near the highway. The work was hard, but the faces were always changing. Except for one. She remembered a man who had ordered his coffee exactly the same way. The same words, the same emphasis on the heat, and the same insistence on porcelain. In that Maryland diner, a group of students had once laughed at the man, joking that he sounded like a character from a low-budget spy film. The man had never acknowledged them. He had remained a statue, focused entirely on his cup and his old newspaper. Emily had forgotten that man, or she thought she had, until the bell rang that morning in Arlington. The repetition was too perfect to be a coincidence. In the world of counterintelligence, nothing that repeats with such mathematical precision is ever considered an accident. Within weeks, this observation would become the foundation of a federal investigation. But for now, Emily was just a waitress who knew that something was deeply wrong. The next morning, at 6:06 a.m., the man returned. He wore the same coat and sat on the same stool, his spine as rigid as a structural beam. This time, Emily was ready. She watched him directly as she approached. His eyes were a pale, unreadable gray. He wasn't young, yet he didn't look old, he lacked any trace of an accent or a personal history. "Black coffee," he said again, the words identical to the ones from the day before. "No cream. No sugar. Extra hot. In a porcelain cup." Emily brought the order, her heart beating a little faster. She watched him adjust the handle. At 6:12, the first 2 sips. At 6:14, the long, calculated pause. She told herself it was just a man who enjoyed his routine. Many men sought comfort in the familiar. But as the month progressed, the routine never wavered, not even by an inch. On Memorial Day, when the diner opened its doors much later than usual, the man was there, standing by the entrance, waiting for the lock to turn. He did not seem annoyed. On a Thursday of torrential rain, when the traffic was paralyzed and the diner was nearly empty, he arrived on schedule. He didn't even have a drop of water on his tan coat. Even on mornings when the porcelain cups were still hot from the dishwasher, he would wait patiently until one was ready, refusing to accept a standard ceramic mug. He never engaged in small talk. He never asked Emily her name, and he never made use of the restroom. He was a man who existed only within the 24 minutes of his visit. Driven by a sudden impulse, Emily began to save his register receipts. She didn't know why she was doing it, but she felt a strange need to document his existence. At night, in the quiet of her apartment, she would spread the slips of paper across her kitchen table. Date. Time. Amount. They were carbon copies of one another. Near the end of June, the pattern shifted. A second man entered the diner at 6:10. He didn't sit down, instead, he stood by the rack of newspapers, pretending to browse. He glanced toward the third stool where the regular sat. The man with the porcelain cup didn't look up, but his posture seemed to sharpen, his shoulders squaring almost invisibly. The second man cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the quiet diner. "Strong today," he remarked softly, his eyes fixed on the back of the regular's head. The regular lifted his cup, took a single, slow sip, and remained silent. The second man gave a curt nod and walked out the door. The entire meeting lasted only seconds. Emily felt a sudden, sharp tightness in her chest. It wasn't fear, but a cold jolt of recognition. This wasn't a casual greeting, it was a signal, delivered in plain sight. That afternoon, Emily added a note to the back of the latest receipt. She wrote down the time of the encounter and the specific words used by the stranger at the newsstand. She didn't tell her manager or her fellow waitresses. She didn't want to be labeled as paranoid. But she knew that rehearsals are only necessary when a performance is coming. And rehearsals, she realized with a shiver, are never meant to be witnessed by an audience. She was now an unwilling participant in a game she didn't yet understand. The second man failed to return on the following morning. Emily detected his absence long before the sharp chime of the entrance bell could confirm it. It was a hollow sensation, like a tongue searching for a tooth that was no longer there, a jarring gap in the diner's morning architecture that should have been occupied by a silhouette near the newsstand. At exactly 6:03 a.m., the regular visitor entered. He wore the same attire and moved with the same unhurried rhythm. He paused in the doorway just long enough for the latch to fall into place behind him, a small moment of silence he used to gauge the room. He took his usual seat, but Emily noticed a shift, he had arrived 2 minutes early. A subtle drift in a perfect machine. Emily began recording every detail on the backs of the register receipts. She used a dull pencil from the counter, ensuring the graphite marks didn't press through to the other side. She wasn't merely observing a customer anymore, she was monitoring a living system. And systems, she realized, do not fix themselves when they are disturbed, they only adapt to the new reality. A sudden, jarring crash echoed through the diner as a line cook dropped a heavy stainless steel pan. Most of the patrons flinched, a woman in a nearby booth laughed nervously. But the man on the third stool didn't even blink. He didn't pause his sip or turn toward the noise. It wasn't simple calm, it was a wall of absolute insulation against any external distraction. On a Tuesday, the regular paid with a different combination of bills than his usual crisp 5. As Emily counted the change back into his palm, their fingers brushed briefly. His skin was unnervingly dry and smooth, devoid of any calluses or scars of manual labor. These were the hands of a man who worked only with paper and thoughts, never with physical tools or machinery. By June 24, at 6:17 a.m., the diner was bustling with construction crews and early commuters. The second man returned, standing close enough to the regular that their sleeves almost touched. Emily watched through the warped chrome reflection of a napkin holder. "No milk today," he whispered. The regular took a sip, acknowledging the signal without a single word or look. That evening, Emily sorted her growing collection of receipts by date and time on her kitchen table. A terrifying correlation emerged. on every morning that the second man appeared, the regular's arrival time shifted slightly in the days that followed. The machine was recalibrating its gears. That night, she dreamed of white porcelain cups stacking up until they shattered. On the morning of June 28, Emily discovered a small, jagged chip on the rim of the porcelain cup the man always used. She set it aside on a lower shelf, intending to discard it later. When the man arrived at 6:05, she served his coffee in a different, unmarred cup. He didn't speak, but his gaze lingered on the vessel with a cold, piercing intensity that made her skin crawl. At 6:12, he set the cup down with a sharp, heavy thud that was audible even over the kitchen noise. The sound vibrated through the counter and seemed to settle in Emily's chest. A cold flush spread over her skin. She knew he had registered the change in his environment. When he finally left, she retrieved the cup. At the very bottom was a faint, precise pencil line. She scrubbed the porcelain cup with hot water and soap, but the thin graphite stroke remained. It was a deliberate mark that had survived both the heat of the coffee and the chemicals of the wash. That night, she placed the marked cup and the chipped one side by side on her counter. They were proof of a world operating beneath the surface, where objects were merely vessels for signals. By June 30, the pile of receipts and the marked cup felt too heavy to keep secret. She slid the papers into a blank envelope and wrote the word "coffee" on the front in firm letters. She didn't have a name or an address to send it to. She just carried it in her bag like a hidden weapon, waiting for the moment when the pattern would finally force her to make a choice. July 7 arrived with a thick, gray fog that muffled the streets of Arlington. Emily unlocked the diner before the dawn, her movements mechanical. She hid the envelope beneath the register and waited. The regular arrived at 6:01, standing in the doorway longer than usual. He was checking the environment, sensing a change in the air, his gray eyes scanning the counter for a trap. He sat down and she poured the coffee without being asked. For the first time, he didn't adjust the handle of the cup. He just stared at it. When a delivery truck backfired loudly outside, several people jumped, but he only tightened his jaw for a split second. At 6:29, he stood up and, for the very first time, looked directly into Emily's eyes before walking out the door. Later that morning, Harold Bennett came in for his usual breakfast. He was an old government hand, his mind still sharp despite the stroke that had slowed his body. Emily leaned across the counter, her heart hammering. "Harold, have you ever heard of a coffee order being used as a code?" she whispered. The old man's smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of grave concern. Harold's face turned grim as Emily described the man's rigid rituals and the porcelain cup. "Stop listening immediately," he advised, his voice trembling with a weight she didn't understand. "I can't stop," she replied firmly. He studied her face for a long moment, then reached into his jacket and handed her a plain white business card with a single name and a phone number. The secondary figure was nowhere to be seen when the sun began its slow ascent the following morning. Emily sensed the void even before the mechanical chime of the door could announce a visitor. It was a phantom sensation, much like a tongue nervously searching for a tooth that had been pulled, leaving behind only a cold, echoing space in the diner's familiar architecture. The area near the metal newsstand, usually occupied by that silent, browsing shadow, felt unnervingly hollow. It was as if the air itself had thinned in that particular corner of the room. Emily stood frozen for a second, her cloth poised over the counter, noting how the absence of one person could shift the entire equilibrium of the Arlington Grill's morning ritual. At exactly 6:03 a.m., the door swung open, and the primary subject stepped inside. He was draped in the same tan coat, moving with that uncanny, metronomic grace. He stopped just past the threshold, allowing the heavy glass door to click shut behind him. He stood perfectly still, his eyes not searching, but absorbing the room's atmosphere with a hunter's patience. He proceeded to his designated stool, but Emily's internal clock flagged a discrepancy. He had arrived 2 minutes earlier than his established window. In the world of ordinary men, 2 minutes is a trifle, a rounding error. But in a life governed by the absolute precision of a machine, this was a deliberate recalibration, a gear shifting in an invisible engine. Emily's record-keeping grew more clandestine and obsessive. She began noting every arrival on the reverse side of the register receipts using a pencil she kept tucked in her apron. The pencil was dull, ensuring the graphite didn't pierce the thin paper or leave an impression on the counter below. She was no longer a waitress, she was a chronicler of a hidden system. She understood now that systems of this complexity do not simply correct themselves when they encounter an obstacle. Instead, they adapt, absorbing the interference and weaving it into a new, more resilient pattern. Every time she scribbled a timestamp, she felt as though she were mapping the movements of a celestial body that only she was allowed to see. The tension reached a peak one morning when a line cook accidentally fumbled a heavy stainless steel frying pan. The resulting clang was deafening, a sharp explosion of metal that echoed violently through the cramped diner. Most customers flinched instinctively, their shoulders hunching. A woman in a corner booth let out a sharp, nervous peal of laughter. Yet, the man on the third stool remained an island of absolute stillness. He did not pause mid-sip, nor did his eyes drift even a fraction of an inch toward the source of the chaos. It wasn't the calm of a peaceful mind, it was the total insulation of a professional. He was a man who had been trained to exist entirely within his own operational bubble, shielded from the world. On a particular Tuesday, the man departed from his payment ritual. Instead of his customary crisp $5 bill, he placed a specific combination of ones and a 10 on the laminate. As Emily collected the currency, their fingers brushed against one another. The contact was brief, but the sensation was chilling. His skin was unnervingly dry, cool, and perfectly smooth. There were no calluses from heavy lifting, no scars from manual tools, and no stains from grease or ink. These were hands that belonged to a man who lived in the abstract, someone who manipulated symbols, documents, and people. His physicality was merely a vessel for his intellect, a quiet tool kept in pristine condition for a singular, unknown purpose. By the time June 24th arrived, the morning fog over Arlington was thick and suffocating. At 6:17 a.m., the second man finally reappeared. He didn't sit, but moved with a predatory economy toward the counter, standing so close to the regular that their coat sleeves almost grazed one another. Emily watched the scene unfold through the warped reflection of a napkin holder. The air between the two men seemed to vibrate with unspoken information. The stranger leaned in, his lips barely moving as he uttered 4 soft words, "No milk today." The regular acknowledged the phrase by taking a deliberate sip of his porcelain cup. There was no nod, no glance, and no sign of recognition. The signal was received, processed, and filed away. That evening, Emily spread her entire collection of receipts across her kitchen table, arranging them in a complex grid of dates and times. A haunting truth began to reveal itself. On every occasion that the second man had made an appearance, the regular's arrival time for the following week shifted by a precise increment. The machine was refining its synchronization. The realization made the air in her apartment feel heavy and stale. That night, her sleep was haunted by vivid, fractured dreams. She saw endless rows of white porcelain cups, stacked so high they brushed the ceiling, only to watch them develop thin, jagged cracks that spread in total silence. She was drowning in a sea of patterns she couldn't hope to break. The morning of June 28 brought a sudden change that tested the integrity of the routine. While preparing for the dawn rush, Emily noticed a tiny, jagged chip on the rim of the man's preferred porcelain cup. It was a small defect, barely visible to the casual eye, but to her, it looked like a gaping wound. She placed it on a low shelf, hidden away from the light. When the regular visitor arrived at 6:05 a.m., she served his black coffee in a different, flawless cup. She placed it down with the same angle and the same care as always. The man didn't speak a word, but his gaze fell upon the unfamiliar vessel with a cold, terrifying intensity. For several seconds, he simply stared at the porcelain, his eyes like polished flint. At exactly 6:12 a.m., he set the cup down with a sharp, heavy thud that seemed to vibrate through the entire counter. The sound was disproportionately loud in the quiet diner, a deliberate punctuation mark in his silent protest. Emily felt a sudden, icy flush spread across her chest and neck. She knew, with absolute certainty, that he had detected the anomaly. When the man finally rose and exited, the bell chiming behind him, Emily hurried to retrieve the cup. She took it to the light, her hands trembling. Inside, at the very bottom, beneath the dark dregs of the coffee, she found a faint, hairline mark. It was a single, precise pencil stroke, no longer than a thumbnail, etched into the white glaze of the porcelain. She took the cup to the industrial sink and scrubbed it with scalding water and harsh detergents, but the graphite line remained. It was a ghost in the machine, a deliberate signal that had been designed to survive the rigors of cleaning. She realized then that the man wasn't just drinking coffee, he was leaving a record that only a specific person was meant to find. That night, Emily sat at her kitchen counter with the two cups placed side by side. The chipped one and the marked one. They looked like mundane objects, but she saw them as artifacts of a shadow war. In this world, a simple household item was never just an item, it was a vessel for communication, a carrier for a virus of information that lived in the cracks of reality. By June 30th, the weight of her secret had become a physical burden, a constant pressure behind her ribs. She gathered the grid of receipts and the marked cup, placing them in a plain, heavy envelope. She wrote the word "coffee" on the front in a firm, script-like hand. She didn't address it to an agency, she simply kept it near her, waiting for the signal to change. July 7th was a morning of slate-gray skies and a cold, clinging mist that blurred the outlines of the buildings. Emily unlocked the diner's heavy door before the first hint of light, her movements feeling increasingly like a performance. She slipped the envelope into a narrow space beneath the register, her heart thumping rhythmically against her chest wall. The regular arrived at 6:01 a.m. And, for the first time, he paused in the doorway for a long, agonizing minute. He didn't look at Emily, but she could feel him scanning the environment, searching for a subtle change in the diner's temperature. He was sensing the invisible presence of her observation, his gray eyes searching for the trap he knew must be coming. He finally sat, and Emily poured the coffee without waiting for his command. She noticed that he did not reach out to adjust the handle of the cup. He simply stared into the dark liquid, his hands resting flat on the counter. When a delivery truck backfired in the street, the sound was like a gunshot. The man's jaw tightened, just once, before returning to stone. At 6:29 a.m., he stood up to leave, but before he turned to the door, he did something he had never done in all the months of his visits. He turned his head and looked directly into Emily's eyes. The stare was devoid of malice, but it was filled with a chilling, clinical understanding. It was the look of a man who had seen his own ending and accepted it. An hour later, Harold Bennett entered for his usual breakfast. He was a veteran of the bureaucracy, a man whose mind was a library of old government secrets. Emily waited until the counter was clear before leaning in. "Harold," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Have you ever heard of a man using a coffee order as a sequence of codes?" The old man's face transformed instantly. The warmth of his usual greeting was replaced by a rigid, mask-like grimness. He stopped stirring his oatmeal and looked toward the window, his eyes clouded by memories of a colder time. "If you're hearing things like that, Emily," he said softly, "you need to stop listening right now for your own safety." Emily shook her head, her resolve hardening despite the fear. "It's too late for that, Harold. I can't stop. I've already seen too much of the pattern." Bennett studied her for a long, silent minute, gauging her courage. Finally, he reached into the inner pocket of his worn jacket and slid a plain, white business card across the laminate counter toward her. The card was blank on one side, and on the other, it bore only a single name and a 7-digit phone number. There was no logo, no title, and no address. "Don't dial that number unless you are absolutely certain," Harold warned, his voice barely audible over the hum of the diner. "And whatever you do, don't tell a soul that you ever spoke to me." The afternoon after her conversation with Harold, Emily drove to a weathered public telephone located behind a sprawling grocery store on the edge of town. She waited until the parking lot was deserted, the only sound being the distant hum of the highway and the rhythmic ticking of her car's cooling engine. Her fingers shook as she dialed the 7 digits. The line clicked open after only 2 rings. A man's voice, devoid of any warmth or identifying characteristic, answered with a simple acknowledgement. Emily didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I was given this contact," she said, her voice barely a whisper in the cramped booth. "By Harold Bennett. I have something that belongs to a pattern." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end, not the silence of a deadline, but the concentrated quiet of someone processing a high-value data point. "Do not bring anything to us," the voice finally commanded. "Stay exactly where you are. We will come to your residence." The line went dead before she could ask how they knew her address. They arrived the next morning at 9:14 a.m. July 8, 1981. 2 men in dark, nondescript suits and a woman with sharp, observant eyes sat around Emily's small kitchen table. They offered no names, no government credentials, and no titles. They simply opened a leather case and asked her to tell the story from the very first cup. Emily spread the receipts across the wood grain of the table, followed by the envelope and the porcelain cup with the hairline mark. The woman began photographing every item with a high-speed camera, the flash punctuating the kitchen's dim light like a strobe. One of the men picked up the cup, rotating it slowly between his gloved fingers. "You are certain you didn't leave this mark yourself?" he asked, his eyes never leaving the porcelain. "Positive," Emily replied. "It wasn't there when I poured the coffee. It appeared only after he left." The man nodded, his expression remaining a blank wall of professional detachment. They didn't tell her she was right, they only recorded her certainty. The most critical piece of evidence was the matchbook. Emily had retrieved it from the counter after the regular's last visit. The woman opened it with surgical tweezers, sliding out a microscopic strip of 35mm film that had been hidden in the spine. She held it up to the light, confirming its size and the precision of its cut. "Is it a secret plan?" Emily asked, her heart racing. "It is a verification," the man replied. "He isn't collecting secrets here. He is verifying access to paths, parking structures, utility corridors, rear entrances of federal buildings. He is checking the locks on the world's back doors to see if they are still open." The man then traced the timestamps on the receipts with a steady finger. "These arrival times. They aren't random fluctuations," he explained. "They are part of a synchronization protocol. The coffee order itself? It's not a code in the way you imagine. It's a consistency test for the environment. A way to ensure nothing has changed. It tells him if he is still being served by the same person, in the same way, with the same tools," the woman added. "The porcelain cup is his sensor. If you hesitate, or if the cup is different, the sensor triggers a warning." Emily felt a wave of cold nausea. "So when I noticed the chip, he knew I was watching him." They told her they needed the system to continue. "We aren't asking for your help in an arrest," the woman said, her voice dropping an octave. "We are asking you to remain a part of the machine. Do not stop being exactly the same. If the pattern realizes it has been seen, it will simply vanish and rebuild itself elsewhere." Emily returned to work on July 9. Her hands were ice-cold as she reached for the porcelain on the top shelf. The regular arrived at 6:04 a.m., sitting on his usual stool. He looked at the cup, then at her. He didn't adjust the handle. He took his first sip at 6:11, exactly 1 minute off his established average. A deliberate shift. On July 23, the routine reached its breaking point. The regular arrived early, at 5:58 a.m., before the diner was even fully awake. He sat down without removing his tan coat, his posture more rigid than Emily had ever seen it. She poured the coffee into the porcelain cup, her heart hammer tapping against her ribs like a trapped bird. The man didn't drink. He didn't even touch the handle. He simply looked directly at Emily and spoke the first complete sentence she had ever heard from him. "Is there a problem?" he asked. The air in the diner seemed to solidify, turning into a heavy, suffocating pressure. The room narrowed until there was only his gray stare. "No," Emily managed to say, forcing a weak smile that felt like a mask. "Why would there be?" The man studied her face for a long, agonizing moment, searching for the flicker of a lie. Then, he offered a single, curt nod. He took one solitary sip of the coffee, stood up, and walked out into the gray Arlington morning. He never returned. By 6:05 the next day, the third stool remained empty. The diner settled into its usual low morning hum, but for Emily, the silence was deafening. She understood then the profound difference between a missing person and a missing pattern. A person leaves a memory, a pattern leaves a vacuum that nature abhors. On August 2, the second man returned to the Arlington Grill. Emily recognized his walk immediately, but everything else about his behavior had changed. He sat at the counter and ordered black coffee in a standard ceramic mug. He didn't ask for porcelain. He didn't insist on precision. He was messy, loud, and entirely ordinary. "Things change," the man remarked, leaning over his mug with a faint, knowing smile. He left scattered change on the counter, none of it aligned. Emily realized then that the arrest she had envisioned in her mind had never actually happened. There was no handcuffs, no sirens. There was only a transition, a handoff between two systems. The investigation was eventually folded into a larger, more clandestine review that Emily was never allowed to see. She was told once, in a final meeting in a decaying federal building, that the case didn't require arrests to remain active. It was being absorbed. The file remained open, but Emily was no longer a part of its contents. By December, the Arlington Grill underwent a minor renovation. New shelves were installed behind the counter, and the old porcelain cups were boxed up and moved to the darkness of the basement. They were replaced by heavy, standardized mugs ordered in bulk from a commercial supplier. No one ever asked for the porcelain again. The shallow indentation on the laminate counter, where so many quarters had been pressed over the months, began to fade. The constant friction of thousands of other customers eventually wore down the surface, smoothing out the mark of the dead drop check. The physical traces of the shadow war were being erased by the passage of time. Emily stayed at the diner for another year, but every morning when the bell rang at 6:07, she found herself glancing at the third stool. She wasn't looking for the man in the tan coat. She was looking for the ghost of the routine, waiting to see if the world would ever demand to be noticed with such terrifying clarity again. On a rainy morning in April 1982, a young woman entered and ordered black coffee, no cream, no sugar. Emily's hand froze on the pot for a fraction of a second. But the woman didn't ask for porcelain. She didn't wait for a specific time. She was just a person in a hurry, unaware of the ghosts that lived in the order she had just placed. That night, Emily lay awake, listening to the rain against her window. She understood what the official files would never admit: her observation hadn't stopped the machine. It had only forced the gears to move in a different direction. The system was never designed to be defeated, it was designed to survive the very act of being seen. If the same order were spoken again tomorrow by someone who had learned the lessons of the man in the tan coat, Emily knew she might not notice it at all. The signal would be more compressed, the rehearsal more perfect. The most dangerous habits are the ones that finally become truly invisible, blending perfectly into the background of a quiet life.